Vitaly, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov, the Secretary of State, with the votes received in the state of Marco Rubio. That his Ukraine practically scooped out the sanctions potential can be tied up with the primacy of the Russian Federation until the guilt against Ukraine is completed. The head of the American Foreign Policy Department, Zustrichi ministers of the Zakordnik Group of CM, saying that the partners are about the forces with the states received for the wire sanctions against the largest NAFTA companies of the Russian Federation, and PPR Rubio on the fact that you are those sanctions. Yaki for the rights with the states received that their partner. The statement of the American Sovereign Secretary has its own truth. Although according to the fact that the Russian Federation of the DPR went into circumventions of frequent sanctions, tied from the energy sector, and on the so-called shadow fleet itself, the sale of NAFTA through companies, I am not tied from the largest on auto corporations of the Russian Federation. However, the whole practice of KPR can change so much, although according to the fact that for a long time, the United States did not allow the company to tie up shares of the Russian company Lukoil, from one of the oligarchs closest to Putin, Timchenko. I have already left before the new sanctions list from the received states. Of course, such a statement by the Sovereign Secretary from the states received a trade signal to the Kremlin's address is also obvious. Russian President Putin could not have been persuaded to Donald Trump is unlikely to ban, but sanctions against the Russian economy. Although we understand that there are still such sanctions in the American arsenal, the application can also be a signal to the address of the European partners from the received states about me, Rubio. Having guessed at their notorious bins, telling the control of those sanctions, Yaki, and extremely with the receipt of the states. You can tell the Europeans about the reluctance to confiscate Russian assets. The eyelids are on the balance of European financial institutions. Before the PPR, the European Commission failed about Belgium. There are left-hand parts on such assets before their confiscation. And Norway has gone to Yak to Ukraine. I am often on my sovereign fund. I am to guarantee a new pose for Ukraine. The decisive type of such an option is the statement of the Minister of Finance of the T of Ukraine, Jens Stoltenberg. This rank has overgrown the European Union, in fact, does not overestimate the number of financial instruments for Ukraine. Before the hands of the Russian-Ukrainian guilt, and the Sovereign Secretary of the United States received in his statement the crotch of the sanctions potential with the Ponekady of Ukraine, the European Union before the purchase of such instruments. In the open, the attempt to discount all these claims is overstated, and the sanctions disc can be filled with Russian President Putin. And I will accept his guilt against Ukraine. With Rubio's statement, we are again in a situation where the Americans respect the Russian president's headache to complete the guilt. The occupation of the Donetsk region by Russian troops, and often I am under the control of a legitimate Ukrainian row at a time. Moreover, the Sovereign Secretary from the received states under the chairs for Ukraine did not miss such a mind. And with such a rank, the kind of visibility for avoiding the continuation of Russia's guilt against Ukraine is already laying not on the Americans all the sanctions could be for seeing off, and not on the Europeans, but on the Ukrainian, not loving to act often on their territory, for the joy of the end of the war. We are, of course, more mythological than Putin, that the Russian president is unlikely to end the blame-adoring. Turned off the occupation of those frequent on the territory of the Donetsk region I overestimate, under the control of the defense forces of Ukraine. But the wars are still not uploaded, but frozen by the fact that Russia is not elected, and the Kherson regions. The Yaks are under the control of the Ukrainian order, respecting the occupied, and frequent their constitutional territory. And with such a rank of wine in the frequent on the territory of print, the moment you decide what to get from him. And Kiev at the collapse of those perennial soap houses. And on the 3rd, I did not go numb to the President of the Russian Federation, and those minds had their guilt torn off by the beard. For Ukraine, before the collapse of the Ukrainian state and the transition of Moscow's pit control from the territory of Ukraine. And for the Trump administration, we are, of course, important on the Russian-Ukrainian front. For the rocky sprat of a friendly beard between the Russian and the Ukrainian temple. For the Trump administration, they are important in the fire on the Russian-Ukrainian front. Another president with a peacemaker received in the state at the moment of the voice and on the style of the Nobel Prize obhidny to him. Moreover, the oldest networks have already closed the mustache of the candidates for the Nobel Prize. And Donald Trump will not be able to get serious damage from the soap process, not to fuck with the Nobel laureates. For 2020. So, marnoslavstvo and misunderstanding of the real situation. Standing as the main motive of the actions of the American administration on the Russian-Ukrainian strait. And I will accept Marco Rubio, these are American officials' signals to the address of Moscow. So, I remind you, the Minister of Finance, with the cattle best received in the state, spoke about the continuation of the sanctions search in Russia. I do not turn off the new sanctions of the administration of the Kremlin. And the sovereign secretary from the received states is literally for a sprat. You mean that but sanctions are unlikely to be what the United States does not know about me? Well, it is known that Putin, dressing up for all the problems. You are in Moscow for the rights of energy sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. For the wire ended before their residual rights overestimate, Tilke laughed at Donald Trump. Notified even for the dignified president to compromise in the Kremlin overestimate the priority and foreign policy. Dyakuyu. Inflate on the topic of the channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social channels Patreon and Donatella. It helps to develop these resources, the sponsorship function itself to cool down.